This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The small, affluent town of Kingswell had always prided itself on its reputation, its schools ranked among the best in Texas, its teachers revered as model citizens, its students the picture of success. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. A community where wealth, education, and prestige intertwined seamlessly. But beneath this glossy exterior, cracks had started to form, imperceptible at first but growing ever wider, threatening to unravel the very fabric of what had once been a tightly knit, respectable town. For years, Kingswell High had stood as a beacon of excellence, a symbol of the American dream. The school's reputation stretched far beyond its classrooms, boasting a history of successful graduates who went on to attend Ivy League universities, join top corporations, and dominate local politics. It was a place where the children of the elite thrived, an institution that rewarded privilege and hard work with the promise of even more privilege and opportunity. However, beneath this polished veneer, things were not as they seemed. The teachers who had once been the heart of Kingswell High were beginning to change, their frustrations festering in silence. Ms. Davis and Ms. Wilder had all been pillars of the school, respected, trusted, and for the most part admired. To the students, they were the model of professionalism, the kind of educators one would expect in a town like Kingswell, dedicated, intelligent, and seemingly free of flaws. What the students didn't know, however, was that the three teachers were far from happy. The school's perfect image had grown more like a suffocating mask to them, each day spent pretending to be someone they were not, burying feelings of resentment, bitterness, and disillusionment. For Ms. Davis, it had all started with a feeling of injustice. She had entered the teaching profession full of passion and idealism, but years of dealing with the entitled attitudes of her students had worn her down. Kingswell High was full of students who believed they were entitled to everything: academic success, college admissions, social power simply by virtue of their family's wealth. And yet, despite the pressure to perform, many of these students never had to work for their success. They would walk into class late, distracted by their phones, their minds elsewhere, their attitudes one of bored superiority. The students who struggled, who were truly trying to make something of themselves, were often left behind in the wake of the more privileged ones. Ms. Davis saw this injustice every day, and it gnawed at her. Her own daughter, a bright, hard-working student, was constantly overshadowed by her classmates, their advantages rendering her efforts meaningless. But what hurt even more was the realization that the school itself, its administration, its wealthy patrons seemed indifferent to the plight of those like her daughter. It was a school built on the notion of meritocracy, but it was a meritocracy that only worked for those already in power. For Mr. Thompson, it was the crushing weight of responsibility that had begun to take its toll. As the head of the history department, he had always taken pride in his work. But over the years, he had begun to notice something disturbing about the students in his class. They were disengaged, disinterested in the lessons he worked so hard to create. They would feign attention, nodding along as he lectured about historical events, but their minds were elsewhere, on social media, on their status, on the next party or expensive vacation. The students were learning nothing, but no one seemed to care. Worse yet, those students whose parents donated large sums of money to the school seemed to get preferential treatment. They would show up late, fail to complete assignments, and yet their grades would remain unscathed, their behavior excused with a wave of the principal's hand. Mr. Thompson could see it clearly: the school system was broken, its priorities all wrong. Instead of fostering a true love of learning, it had become a machine to reinforce the social and economic status of those who needed it least. And this, he realized, was the very system he was a part of. He had become a cog in a wheel that did nothing but spin, endlessly, without any true purpose. The weight of it all was suffocating. Ms. Wilder, a young teacher who had only been at Kingswell High for 5 years, had come to the school with dreams of making a difference. She had believed that her subject, literature, had the power to ignite change, to challenge her students to think critically about the world around them. But instead, she found herself caught in a world of apathy, where the students were more concerned with getting into the best colleges than with developing their own voices. Worse still, the school's administration had begun to impose rigid guidelines on what could and could not be taught, stifling her ability to truly engage with her students. Her passion for teaching was slowly being smothered by a system that was more interested in results than in the well-being or development of the individuals within it. She had tried to reach out to her students, to get them to think beyond the grades, but it was as if they were all locked inside their own little worlds, unaffected by the lessons she worked so hard to impart. As time passed, her disillusionment grew, until it became impossible to ignore. She saw the school for what it truly was: a factory, churning out students who were good at taking tests and following instructions, but who lacked the capacity for critical thought or empathy. The students, the parents, and even the administrators seemed trapped in a cycle of empty competition, where winning was the only goal, and everything else was irrelevant. The three teachers' frustrations had started as whispers, subtle complaints shared in private, during the brief moments of respite between classes. But as the days turned into weeks, their conversations began to shift. They found common ground in their dissatisfaction, their mutual resentment of the system they were a part of. The more they spoke, the more they realized that their grievances were not just personal, they were indicative of a much larger problem, a problem that affected the students they taught and the society they lived in. They began to see the school as a microcosm of a broken system, one where the privileged few were given all the opportunities, while the majority were left behind. They realized that their anger wasn't just about the students, but about the inequality, the elitism, and the sense of powerlessness that had slowly crept into every aspect of their lives. But as their shared disillusionment grew, so did the idea of revenge. At first it was a fantasy, a fleeting thought, an impossible notion. But as the days went by, the idea began to take shape. What if they could do something to expose the rot at the core of the system? What if they could force the world to see what was really happening inside the walls of Kingswell High? The more they thought about it, the more they realized that they could no longer just sit back and watch. They were teachers, yes, but they were also human beings, and they had been pushed to the brink. They began to see themselves as agents of justice, not just for their own frustrations, but for the students who had been ignored, silenced, and forgotten by the system. What began as a shared sense of injustice slowly transformed into something much darker: a desire for retribution, a thirst to make the system feel the weight of its own failures. And so, the foundation for the Unspeakable Act was laid. What had started as quiet resentment was now a full-fledged conspiracy, one that would shake Kingswell to its core, exposing the cracks in the system for all to see. But no one could have known just how far those cracks would go, nor could anyone predict the horror that was about to unfold. The school had always prided itself on its prestigious reputation. Set in a wealthy corner of Texas, the sprawling campus was an imposing sight, a collection of state-of-the-art facilities, ivy-clad buildings, and manicured lawns. On the surface, it was a beacon of success, a place where young minds were honed into the future leaders of America. It was a school that sent its graduates to the Ivy League, a place where parents paid top dollar for their children's futures, and where the wealthy elite sent their sons and daughters to be molded into successful, influential figures. The kind of school that oozed privilege, where money and power bled through every polished surface, and where the families of the students were often more concerned with maintaining status than with the lives of those outside their rarefied bubble. But beneath the pristine exterior, there was a darker, more insidious reality. The students, many of whom came from multi-million-dollar homes, wore their privilege like a badge of honor. They were taught to be the best, to excel at any cost, but this relentless pressure bred an environment of elitism and cruelty. The students, accustomed to being given whatever they wanted, harbored a sense of entitlement that bordered on arrogance. They were the sons and daughters of corporate giants, politicians, and socialites, and their worldview was shaped by their wealth and influence. Compassion and empathy were foreign concepts to them. Their value systems were determined by their ability to outperform, to win, and to come out on top. Those who couldn't keep up, those who struggled or came from less privileged backgrounds, were easily cast aside. It was a school that prided itself on its success stories but turned a blind eye to the suffering that came with it. The pressure to be perfect, to constantly outshine their peers, created a competitive and toxic atmosphere. The students were expected to be flawless, perfect grades, flawless appearances, and impeccable social status. Anyone who failed to meet these expectations was ridiculed, ostracized, and left to languish in the shadows. The teachers were just as complicit in this system. They were a part of it, bound by their own desires for status and recognition. The faculty were well aware of the disparities within the student body, but they chose to turn a blind eye to the cruelty that played out in the classrooms and hallways. Some of them even encouraged the students' sense of superiority, rewarding their achievements without questioning the underlying motivations. The atmosphere was one of quiet complicity, where those who rose to the top were celebrated, and those who were left behind were discarded. For the three teachers, the ones who would eventually carry out the unthinkable, the reality of the school had become a suffocating cage. At first, they had joined the school with enthusiasm, eager to inspire and educate. But over time, they began to see the darker side of the institution. They saw the bullying, the casual cruelty, and the overwhelming pressure that consumed the students. They saw the students who came from impoverished families, doing their best to fit in, constantly judged for their clothes, their accents, their backgrounds. They saw the way the wealthier students turned their noses up at those they deemed beneath them. The system wasn't built to nurture talent, it was built to perpetuate a cycle of privilege and superiority, where those who already had power thrived, and those who didn't were quietly ignored. The three teachers, each with their own personal demons, had become increasingly disillusioned. Ms. Davis, the youngest of the three, had been the first to notice the divide between the students. As a child of modest means, she had always struggled with fitting into this world of affluence. Her own experiences had shaped her worldview, and over time she grew disgusted by the way her students treated one another. It wasn't just the bullying that disturbed her, it was the complete lack of empathy. The way students from privileged backgrounds saw their less fortunate peers as expendable. She could see the cracks in the system, but her attempts to speak out or make a difference were dismissed as naive. The administration turned a blind eye to the toxic culture, valuing test scores and college admissions above the well-being of the students. Mr. Carter, the middle-aged teacher, had been in education long enough to see the rise of this kind of elitism in schools. Once an idealist, he had hoped to make a difference, to shape young minds. But over the years, the overwhelming pressures of standardized tests and parent expectations had worn him down. He had watched as students who were already wealthy and successful became even more entitled, while those who struggled were left to fend for themselves. The cruelty that existed in the hallways seemed to seep into every part of the school, and Mr. Carter felt a growing sense of helplessness. He had seen the emotional toll the school was taking on the less privileged students, but nothing ever changed. He had come to feel trapped in the system, unable to make a meaningful impact. The disparity between the students had grown too vast, too entrenched for him to ignore. Mrs. Ellis, the oldest of the three, had been at the school for decades. She had seen generations of students come and go, but the environment had changed in ways she couldn't reconcile. Her own sense of purpose had eroded over time as she had become more and more disillusioned with the school's culture. The parents' constant demands, the expectations to push students to the brink for the sake of college admissions, and the overall sense of privilege that pervaded the classrooms had hardened her. She had become cynical, her belief in education, as a force for good, slowly replaced with a cold recognition of the school's true purpose to maintain the status quo, to feed the rich and powerful, and to keep the less fortunate out of the picture. The school had become a factory, not of learning, but of reproducing the same inequalities that ran deep in society. It was within these cracks, these silent fractures in the system, that the seeds of something darker began to take root. These teachers, once passionate about their work, had become bitter and resentful. They had seen the system fail time and again, and they had watched as their students, particularly the ones from affluent families, became more and more indifferent to the struggles of others. They had seen the injustice, felt it firsthand, and now they had come to believe that the only way to right the wrongs of the world was through force. They knew they couldn't change the system from the inside. They had tried. They had failed. The students, the very people they were supposed to guide, had become the target of their frustration. The system had failed them, and now they would take matters into their own hands. The school, with its polished exterior and dark underbelly, had become their battleground. They weren't just teachers anymore. They were agents of something darker, driven by an anger that had festered for too long. And they were ready to make the world see the truth, no matter the cost. The stage was set. The idea began as a vague whisper, a fleeting thought in the back of their minds that slowly grew louder, more insistent. The teachers Ms. Davis, Mr. Carter, and Mrs. Ellis had long since ceased seeing themselves as educators. They were no longer mentors, no longer guides for young minds. They were agents of a different kind of justice, one that had been bubbling under the surface for years. The injustice they had witnessed, the relentless cruelty and entitlement of the privileged students, had eroded any remaining sense of idealism. And as their plans took shape, the line between right and wrong became irreparably blurred. They were no longer just disgruntled educators, they were soldiers in a silent war, ready to act. The first step was the observation. They had to learn the school's every detail, its rhythms, its pulse. Every hallway, every classroom, every fire exit had to be studied until it became second nature. The teachers began to walk the campus with new eyes, no longer taking the familiar sights for granted but seeing them as potential tools in a larger, darker plan. They kept their distance from the other staff, less and less concerned with their colleagues or the students they once cared about. Every conversation was a transaction, every glance a calculation. They became ghosts in the hallways, moving silently, unseen. The trust they had once placed in the system in their roles was gone, and with it went any loyalty to the school or the students they had once believed in. Ms. Davis took the lead in the planning. She had the sharpest mind, the one that saw patterns where others saw only chaos. She spent her nights combing through the school's blueprints, studying the security cameras, the locations of key offices, the positioning of the classrooms, and the exits. She found the blind spots, the areas where security was weakest, the places where surveillance cameras didn't reach. She mapped out the building like an artist sketching a battlefield. Every step was calculated, every move planned with precision. She studied the school's emergency drills, the fire alarms, and the lockdown protocols. She knew exactly how the students and staff would react in a crisis. It was all too easy. She didn't just want to cause chaos, she wanted to control it, to mold the panic into something purposeful. Mr. Carter was the one who gathered the tools they would need. He knew where to find them, who to speak to, how to acquire what they needed without attracting attention. Guns, explosives, and other weapons became their currency, and Carter had a way of getting what they required. He had connections from his days before teaching old acquaintances who were all too eager to help for the right price. They had to be careful, of course, not to draw suspicion, but Carter was careful, meticulous. The weapons were stored in a hidden compartment under the floorboards of his garage, away from prying eyes. Every weapon was registered under a different name, every piece of equipment accounted for, in a way that made them all but invisible to the outside world. Mrs. Ellis, the oldest of the three, brought the emotional intensity to the plan. She had long ago stopped caring for the well-being of her students, her faith in them shattered by years of seeing the same entitled faces, the same thoughtless actions, the same cruelty masked by a veneer of politeness. She had witnessed the bullying, the exclusivity, the subtle but unmistakable divisions that ran deep in the school's culture. She had seen it all before, and she had come to believe that the only way to shatter the system was to tear it apart from the inside. But she wasn't just angry, she was methodical in her rage. She knew the students. She knew the cliques, the popular groups, the ones who were most likely to panic and make fatal mistakes when the chaos began. She had spent years watching them, understanding their weaknesses, their fears. She knew who would freeze, who would try to run, and who would try to fight back. These insights would be vital when the time came. Together, the three of them formed a dark and twisted alliance. What had started as a desire for retribution evolved into something far more dangerous. It was no longer about just punishing the students, it was about making a statement, an unspoken declaration that the system, the very structure that had protected these privileged few, was broken beyond repair. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but the justification came easily. The students, with their smug entitlement, their gleaming futures that were already mapped out before they'd even stepped foot on campus, had never experienced true hardship. They lived in a world where consequences were an afterthought, where failure was a concept only for the lower classes, the poor, the struggling. And that, to the teachers, was unforgivable. The final piece of the plan fell into place when they decided on the day of the attack. They chose a date when the school would be full of students, but not so full that there wouldn't be enough room to carry out their task. The annual talent show, a high-profile event that brought together the entire student body and faculty, was the perfect opportunity. It was an occasion where the students felt untouchable, as if they were untouchable not just to one another, but to the world itself. It was a day of celebration, of pride, everything the teachers found repulsive. The students would be distracted, swept up in their own sense of superiority, oblivious to the storm that was quietly gathering. Timing was everything. Ms. Davis had calculated the precise moment when the first explosions would go off, the exact second when the school would descend into chaos. The plan was simple, but its execution had to be flawless. The teachers would start the attack by triggering a series of controlled explosions in the most crowded areas of the school near the auditorium where the talent show would be taking place, and in the hallways leading to the main exits. It would create the maximum amount of confusion, a disorienting wave of panic that would leave the students scrambling, unsure of where to go or what to do. In the chaos, they would make their move, hunting down those who couldn't escape, those who were too slow, too frightened. The teachers knew that in a situation like this, fear would be their greatest weapon. They weren't just creating death and destruction, they were creating terror. The plan was not to make it quick or painless, it was to make the students feel helpless, to make them experience, even for a moment, what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be the victim of a system that had, for so long, left them untouchable. Everything had been set in motion. The weapons were in place. The students would be in their prime targets. The clock was ticking. There would be no turning back. And so the teachers, now transformed into something unrecognizable, stood at the precipice. They had seen the world for what it truly was, a place where the powerful were untouchable and the weak were left to perish. They were no longer just educators, they were harbingers of chaos, bringing the storm that would tear the system apart. The plan was perfect. The execution would be even more so. The day dawned like any other, bright and unassuming, with the sun climbing over the horizon and casting its golden light across the sprawling campus. The school, perched atop its hill like an impenetrable fortress, seemed to glow with the quiet certainty of its own grandeur. Students filed in with their usual sense of entitlement, heads high, chins up, their conversations revolving around the upcoming talent show that had taken weeks to prepare for. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, of rehearsals and performances, an event that would elevate the chosen few in the eyes of their peers. But underneath the rehearsed smiles and carefree chatter, something darker simmered beneath the surface. The teachers had come early, just as they had planned. Ms. Davis was the first to arrive, slipping through the school gates before the students and the other staff had even begun their morning routines. Her heart was pounding, but there was no hesitation in her steps. Every corner of the school felt familiar to her now, every creak in the floorboards and every hidden hallway that led to a secluded exit. She was a ghost in the system, a presence that moved without being seen. The halls were still quiet, the echoes of her footsteps the only sound as she made her way to the back of the auditorium. There she checked the timers one final time, ensuring that everything was set to go off at precisely 10:15 a.m. The explosions would be their signal, the moment that would break the facade of normalcy and plunge the school into the nightmare they had all been waiting for. Next came Mr. Carter, carrying the weapons in bags that looked innocuous at first glance. His hands were steady, though his mind raced with anticipation. He moved like a man possessed, driven by a dark sense of purpose. The school felt suffocating now, but he welcomed the tension, the silent knowing that everything was about to change. He deposited the bags in the places they had planned, strategically placing explosives near the entrances and key hallways. His heart thudded in his chest, but there was no turning back now. As he looked around, he noticed the students starting to trickle in for their rehearsals. They walked with their heads held high, faces bathed in the warm morning light, blissfully unaware of the horror that was about to descend upon them. Mrs. Ellis arrived last, her movements deliberate and slow, as though savoring every second of the moment before everything would come to a head. She walked through the school like a familiar haunt, knowing the rhythm of the students' movements, where they would gather, and how they would react when the violence began. Her place was near the back of the school, close to the stairwells where the students would scramble, panicked, trying to escape. She had always known this day would come, the moment when the carefully constructed walls of privilege would come crashing down. She wasn't afraid. There was no room for fear in her heart anymore. She had seen enough. It was time to make them feel what they had made others feel: small, powerless, insignificant. The first blast tore through the air at exactly 10:15 a.m. The sound was deafening, a guttural roar that shook the very foundations of the school. The force of the explosion sent a shockwave through the walls, rattling windows and cracking the ceiling. The students, in the middle of their rehearsals and practices, froze, confusion spreading through the air like a contagious disease. Some of them screamed, others looked around in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Panic spread in waves. But it wasn't chaos yet. The teachers had planned for that. They needed the students to be confused first, to give them time to carry out the next phase of the plan. Another explosion ripped through the hallway by the administration building, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. The air was thick with smoke now, making it hard to breathe. But the most terrifying part was the silence that followed each blast. For a moment there was nothing, just an eerie, expectant pause. And then, as the smoke began to clear, the true horror of the day began to unfold. Screams echoed down the hallways as students tried to make sense of the chaos around them. They rushed toward the exits, but they were met with locked doors, security gates, and the growing realization that escape wasn't as easy as they had once thought. The halls were a maze now, a labyrinth of fear and confusion. The students had no idea where to run. The explosions had caused mass panic, and the teachers had made sure to cut off all avenues of escape. Ms. Davis watched from the shadows, her eyes cold and unfeeling as she saw the first of the students try to make a break for it. She had expected this. She had calculated every move, every decision. The students were nothing more than prey now, their lives insignificant in the grand scheme of what they had done. She stood motionless as a group of students fled down the corridor, only to be met with the deafening sound of another blast from below. their faces twisted in terror as they turned to run in the opposite direction. But it was too late. The school had become a hunting ground, and the teachers were the predators. The once pristine halls were now filled with smoke and blood. Mr. Carter was in the thick of it, his face grim as he moved from room to room, methodically carrying out his part of the plan. The students who had once strutted through the hallways like kings and queens were now scrambling for their lives. Those who had once been invincible were now helpless, caught in the very system they had once lorded over. Mrs. Ellis took a moment to watch the chaos unfold, savoring the sight of the students' fear. She knew that many of them would not survive this day. But that was the point. The world had turned its back on the people who were truly deserving of compassion, and now she was here to make them feel what it was like to be powerless. To be just another face in the crowd, struggling to survive. She had seen it all before, but now it was her turn to rewrite the rules. The students were starting to panic. The air was thick with smoke, the stench of burning debris mixing with the acrid scent of fear. Some of them screamed for help, but help was nowhere to be found. Teachers who had once been their protectors were now nowhere to be seen. The school had become a tomb, and the walls seemed to close in on them as they ran through the hallways, looking for escape, looking for anyone who could help them. But there was no one. The teachers had planned this meticulously. They had anticipated every move, every reaction. As the bloodshed continued, a final explosion rocked the building, this time in the heart of the auditorium. It was the final blow, the one that would signal the end of the nightmare. As the building began to crumble, the survivors, those few who managed to escape the carnage, would be left to wander through the wreckage, forever haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. The school, once a symbol of privilege and success, was now nothing more than a graveyard for the victims of their own arrogance. The day of horror had only just begun, and already, the school was unrecognizable. The teacher's perfect scheme had worked, and now nothing would ever be the same. The chaos that followed the massacre was swift, suffocating, and incomprehensible. The first reports trickled in within minutes, confused, disjointed accounts from frantic survivors, first responders, and social media posts filled with graphic images that painted a picture of horror too vast to fully comprehend. News outlets rushed to the scene, their cameras capturing the aftermath, but nothing could truly encapsulate the magnitude of what had occurred. The once pristine school, a beacon of wealth and success, was now a charred ruin. Students and faculty alike lay dead or dying, their bodies scattered across the campus in twisted heaps, like a macabre painting come to life. The blast had been the trigger, but the fear, the panic, the desperation that followed was the true story of the day. Those who had escaped the initial explosions found themselves trapped in hallways filled with smoke, their paths to freedom blocked by debris and rubble. The screams of the wounded echoed through the school, blending with the distant sounds of sirens as ambulances rushed to the scene. But for many, it was already too late. The teachers, who had once been guardians of knowledge, had become executioners, and the campus was their battleground. As the hours passed, more and more victims were discovered, some in classrooms, others in stairwells, trying to flee or shield themselves from the onslaught. The sheer scale of the death toll was unfathomable. 59 students, all from different walks of life, from the rich to the privileged to the entitled, had been slaughtered in cold blood. Their lives, once full of promise and potential, had been snuffed out in an instant, their futures erased by a wave of violence too cruel to process. News outlets across the country scrambled to cover the story, but even they struggled to keep up. The names of the deceased were read aloud, one after the other, their faces displayed on screens in grim memoriam. Parents waited anxiously for word of their children, some of them holding out hope against all reason, others succumbing to the terrible truth as the bodies were identified. The nation, it seemed, had been plunged into a collective state of disbelief, as if the horror was too extreme to be real, too surreal to be true. The media pundits began their analysis, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. How could this happen? What had driven 3 teachers, trusted, respected figures, to commit such an atrocity? The questions flooded in faster than the answers. Was it a failure of the education system? A systemic breakdown? Was it simply a tragic, isolated act of violence? Or was it something deeper, more insidious, a reflection of the society's growing divide between the privileged and the marginalized? A society that had allowed such anger to fester? The theories were endless, but the answer eluded everyone. For every bit of information that surfaced, 100 more questions arose. It didn't take long for the public to start pointing fingers, seeking someone or something to blame. Some focused on the school's administration, accusing them of ignoring the warning signs, of perpetuating a system that bred inequality and arrogance. Others targeted the teachers themselves, questioning how people who had dedicated their lives to shaping young minds could turn so violently against those they were entrusted to educate. But the most chilling part of all was the realization that the massacre was not a random act. It had been meticulously planned, thought out in terrifying detail, a sickening masterpiece of vengeance. It was no longer just an isolated tragedy, it was a dark statement, a violent rejection of a system that had allowed privilege to flourish unchecked. The victims were not nameless, faceless casualties. They were the very embodiment of that privilege, the children of the rich, the entitled, the future leaders of the country. And that, perhaps, was what made the massacre so horrifyingly powerful. The aftermath of the massacre sent shockwaves across the nation. No corner of the country was untouched by the tragedy. Conversations about gun control, mental health, and the failures of the education system dominated headlines. But beyond the political debates, the real toll was the quiet grief that settled over families, communities, and entire cities. The pain was not just the loss of life, but the deep, lingering sense that something had broken in the world, something that could never be repaired. In the weeks that followed, investigations into the teachers' backgrounds and motivations revealed a twisted, painful truth. AMS Davis, Mr. Carter, and Mrs. Ellis had not acted on a whim. They had been pushed to the brink by years of seeing the cruelty and privilege that defined the students they taught. They had been part of a system they no longer believed in, a system that rewarded arrogance, entitlement, and indifference. In their minds, they had become the agents of a revolution, a cleansing that would eradicate the very foundation of that system. But what they hadn't anticipated was the sheer scale of the destruction they would leave in their wake. The nation reeled, as the victims' families mourned and the survivors grappled with the trauma of a nightmare they could never escape. The school, once a symbol of success, had become a scar on the landscape, a reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly everything could be torn apart. In the end, there would be no closure, no answers that could heal the wounds. The country had been irrevocably changed by the horror, and in the silence that followed, there was a collective understanding something had been broken, something had been lost, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the dust settled and the nation began to recover from the shock of the massacre, a chilling truth began to emerge from the investigation. The teachers MS, Davis, Mr. Carter, and Mrs. Ellis had not acted alone. A hidden network, long concealed within the very fabric of the school, began to unravel. At first, it seemed like the three educators were simply disillusioned individuals, driven to the edge by their frustrations with the system. But as investigators dug deeper, disturbing connections began to surface, ties to a shadowy organization within the school's administration. Whispers started to circulate about a secret group, an elite faction of faculty and staff who had long believed in the notion of reforming society through violent, radical means. This group, isolated and operating under the radar, had spent years quietly nurturing the discontent of its members, pushing them to see themselves as agents of change, willing to sacrifice everything for their warped vision of justice. The teachers had been their pawns, but they were also complicit in something much larger, something darker. The massacre was not just an isolated act of revenge, it was part of a greater plan to destroy the very foundation of a system they had long come to despise. The deeper the investigation went, the more disturbing the connections became. The network stretched beyond the school itself, pulling in high-ranking officials who had turned a blind eye to the growing extremism within their ranks. The teachers, it seemed, had been groomed for this moment, trained in secrecy, indoctrinated by a twisted ideology that had been brewing for years. And while they had believed they were striking a blow against a broken system, they had unknowingly become the instruments of something far more insidious. The nation was stunned, unable to process the revelations. What had seemed like a senseless act of violence was now revealed to be a horrifying piece of a much larger conspiracy, and the true scale of the betrayal began to sink in. The monsters were not just the teachers, but the system that had allowed their hatred to grow unnoticed, unchecked. The question now was no longer how to heal from the tragedy, but how deep the rot went, and who was still hiding in the shadows. The real terror was only beginning.